welcome. This is a calm and unhurried history, told quietly and without urgency. There is nothing you need to remember, and nothing you need to focus on. You can listen closely if you wish, or simply let the words pass by in the background as your mind begins to rest. Tonight, we will move slowly through everyday life in the past, following familiar routines, ordinary moments, and gentle patterns that once shaped the days of earlier people. If you fall asleep along the way, that is perfectly fine. The story will continue at the same calm pace, whether you are listening or resting. In the centuries before modernity became visible in daily life, rural communities followed rhythms that had been established over long periods of time. These rhythms were shaped by land, weather, custom, and repetition rather than by innovation or speed. Villages were small and familiar, often consisting of a few clustered homes built from timber and stone, surrounded by fields that were worked year after year in much the same way. People typically lived close to where they worked, and their understanding of time was connected less to clocks and more to daylight, seasons, and the steady return of tasks that were never entirely finished. Life in these rural settings was not static, but change moved slowly and often quietly. Practices were adjusted rather than replaced, and knowledge was passed down through observation and routine rather than formal instruction. Farming methods, household work, and local customs continued, because they were known to function within the limits of available tools and labor. Most villagers did not think of their way of life as something temporary or transitional. It was simply how life remained, generation after generation, shaped by familiarity and expectation. Over time, however, subtle pressures began to appear. These pressures were not always immediately recognized as signs of a larger shift. They arrived in the form of small adjustments, changes in land use, variations in population size, and gradual differences in how goods were exchanged. In some areas, fields were reorganized or expanded, while in others, boundaries became more clearly defined. These changes did not occur all at once, and they were often uneven, affecting some villages earlier than others. Rural households continued to rely heavily on shared labor and cooperation. Tasks such as planting, harvesting, repairing buildings, and preparing food were often carried out with the involvement of family members and neighbors. This cooperation reinforced social bonds and created a sense of continuity that made change less noticeable. Even when new ideas or methods were introduced, they were usually absorbed into existing patterns rather than causing immediate disruption. The pace of life remained steady, shaped by repetition and predictability. Days were structured around essential activities, and nights brought rest that was aligned with darkness rather than artificial light. Even when new ideas or methods were introduced, they were usually absorbed into existing patterns rather than causing immediate disruption. The pace of life remained steady, shaped by repetition and predictability. Days were structured around essential activities, and nights brought rest that was aligned with darkness rather than artificial light. Trade routes, seasonal markets, and occasional travelers brought glimpses of different practices and possibilities. These encounters did not immediately transform village life, but they introduced ideas that lingered quietly. Over long periods, such influences accumulated, creating conditions in which gradual transformation could take place. As populations slowly increased in some regions, pressure on land became more noticeable. Fields that had once been sufficient for small communities now needed to support larger households. This led to changes in how land was divided and managed, sometimes encouraging more intensive use of available resources. These adjustments were practical responses rather than deliberate steps toward modernity. Yet they contributed to a gradual reorganization of rural life. The relationship between villagers and their environment also continued to evolve. Weather patterns, soil conditions, and the availability of resources influenced decisions that shaped daily routines. When harvests were good, life continued much as before. When conditions were difficult, households adapted by modifying practices or seeking additional support within the community. Over time, these adaptations contributed to a slow accumulation of experience and knowledge that would later support larger transitions. Rural life at this stage remained deeply rooted in continuity. The concept of progress was not yet central to how people understood their world. Instead, survival, stability, and the preservation of familiar patterns guided decision-making. Change existed, but it moved quietly, often unnoticed, embedded within routines that appeared timeless to those living them. As rural communities continued to function within long-established patterns, gradual adjustments began to appear in the organization of work and land. These changes were not sudden departures from tradition, but careful modifications that reflected shifting needs and circumstances. Farmers often responded to these pressures by altering how fields were used, how labor was distributed, and how time was managed throughout the year. Such adjustments accumulated slowly, shaping daily life in ways that felt natural rather than disruptive. One of the most noticeable areas of change involved the division and use of land. In some regions, communal fields were reorganized to improve efficiency or clarify responsibility. This did not immediately eliminate shared practices, but it introduced a greater emphasis on defined boundaries and individual accountability. These changes often emerged from practical concerns, such as the need to ensure consistent harvests or reduce disputes. Over time, they encouraged villagers to think differently about ownership and responsibility. Even while traditional customs remained influential, work within rural households also began to shift in subtle ways. While family labor continued to be central, tasks were sometimes redistributed to accommodate changing conditions. For example, certain activities that had once been seasonal became more regular, while others were adjusted to align with emerging opportunities for trade or exchange. These shifts were rarely formalized, but they reflected a growing awareness of how labor could be organized more effectively. Daily routines remained closely tied to natural cycles, yet small changes in scheduling and coordination became more common. Markets and fairs, which had long existed as periodic events, gradually took on greater importance. Participation in these gatherings encouraged villagers to produce goods not only for their own use, but also for exchange. This introduced a modest but meaningful connection between rural households and wider economic networks. The introduction of new tools or techniques also contributed to gradual change. Improvements were often incremental, building upon familiar designs rather than replacing them entirely. When a tool proved useful, it was adopted slowly and shared through observation rather than instruction. This process ensured that innovation did not feel foreign or threatening, but instead became part of the established rhythm of work. Social relationships within villages continued to play a central role in managing change. Decisions about land use, labor, and cooperation were often shaped by custom and mutual understanding. Elders and experienced workers influenced how adjustments were made, ensuring that changes aligned with collective expectations. This social framework helped maintain stability even as practices evolved. Over time, these gradual adjustments began to influence how rural life was perceived. While modernity was still distant, the foundations for later transformation were quietly being laid. Villagers became accustomed to small changes and adaptations, developing a capacity to respond to new circumstances without abandoning familiar structures. This flexibility would later prove important as more significant shifts emerged. The pace of change remained slow, and many aspects of daily life continued much as before. Meals were prepared using traditional methods. Homes were maintained with familiar materials, and clothing reflected long-standing practices. Yet beneath this continuity, the accumulation of small adjustments was reshaping the relationship between people, land, and work. These early changes did not announce themselves as a transition into a new era. Instead, they blended into daily routines, becoming part of the background of rural life. The process was quiet and extended over generations, making it difficult for any single individual to recognize its significance. Still, these gradual adjustments marked the beginning of a longer journey toward modernity, one that would unfold slowly and unevenly across rural landscapes. Within rural villages, the household remained the central unit of economic life for many centuries. Most production was organized around meeting immediate needs rather than creating surplus for distant exchange. Food, clothing, tools, and shelter were typically produced within the household or acquired through close neighbors. This form of self-reliance did not mean isolation, but it did shape how villagers understood value, labor, and time. Work was undertaken because it was necessary, not because it promised growth or expansion. Over time, however, the household economy began to stretch gently beyond its earlier boundaries. This expansion was not dramatic, and it did not disrupt daily routines all at once. Instead, it emerged through small opportunities for exchange that slowly became more regular. Villagers might carry extra grain, cloth, or simple crafted items to nearby markets, not as a primary source of income, but as a way to supplement household needs. These exchanges were occasional at first, fitting into existing rhythms rather than replacing them. Markets themselves were familiar institutions long before modernity appeared, but their role gradually shifted. What had once been infrequent gatherings, tied closely to seasonal cycles, became more predictable points of interaction. The presence of traders, craftsmen, and travelers introduced a wider range of goods and ideas. even if most villagers continued to rely on local production. Exposure to different items did not immediately alter daily life, but it expanded awareness of alternatives, quietly influencing expectations and preferences. Within the household, labor began to take on slightly different meanings. While most tasks remained tied to survival, some activities were increasingly shaped by the possibility of exchange. Spinning, weaving, or small-scale crafting might be carried out with both household use and market exchange in mind. This dual purpose did not transform work into something entirely new, but it introduced a subtle distinction between production for use and production for trade. Money, where it circulated, did so unevenly and cautiously. Many rural exchanges still relied on barter or customary obligation, but coinage gradually became more familiar. The presence of money did not immediately replace older systems, yet it offered a different way of measuring value. Over long periods, this contributed to a gradual shift in how people thought about labor, goods, and compensation, even if such thoughts remained largely unspoken. Household decision-making adapted slowly to these conditions. Choices about what to grow, make, or repair were still guided primarily by tradition and necessity, but they were also influenced by small opportunities beyond the village. These influences did not disrupt the calm continuity of rural life, but they added layers of consideration that accumulated quietly over time. Social relationships continued to regulate these changes. Exchange was shaped by trust, reputation, and familiarity rather than competition. Villagers often preferred to trade with known individuals, reinforcing social bonds rather than weakening them. This meant that economic expansion did not immediately create sharp divisions or hierarchies, but instead unfolded within existing frameworks of cooperation. The household economy remained grounded in stability, yet it was no longer entirely inward-looking. The slow expansion of exchange introduced rural communities to broader patterns without forcing abrupt adaptation. These changes were absorbed gently, becoming part of the background of daily life. In this way, the household economy began to serve as a quiet bridge between long-standing rural traditions and the distant outlines of a more connected world. As rural life continued its slow evolution, perceptions of time began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. For generations, time had been understood primarily through natural cycles. Day followed night, seasons followed one another, and work expanded or contracted accordingly. This understanding remained central. Yet gradual changes in labor organization introduced additional layers to how time was experienced and managed. Certain tasks became more closely associated with specific schedules, especially those connected to exchange or obligation beyond the household. Market days, seasonal dues, and agreed-upon labor arrangements encouraged villagers to coordinate their activities with greater precision. This did not replace natural rhythms, but it added points of structure that existed alongside them. Over time, these structures became familiar. Labor itself began to be understood not only as a shared necessity, but also as a measurable contribution. While communal work and mutual aid remained important, some forms of labor were increasingly associated with individual responsibility. This shift was gradual and uneven, emerging from practical arrangements rather than formal rules. Still, it influenced how villagers thought about effort, obligation, and fairness within their communities. The relationship between work and reward also adapted slowly. In earlier patterns, effort was closely tied to survival, with outcomes determined largely by environmental conditions. As opportunities for exchange expanded, the connection between labor and outcome became slightly more varied. A well-made item or carefully tended surplus might bring modest benefit beyond immediate needs. These experiences did not transform motivation overnight, but they introduced new dimensions to how work was perceived. Responsibility within the household evolved alongside these changes. While collective decision-making remained common, individuals sometimes took on more defined roles. These roles were not rigid, but they reflected an increasing awareness of skill, experience, and reliability. Over time, this contributed to a more differentiated understanding of contribution, even as cooperation remained central. Time spent on tasks outside the immediate household also increased gradually. Travel to markets, participation in communal projects, and engagement with wider networks required periods away from home. These absences were typically short and infrequent, yet they altered daily routines in small ways. Adjustments were made to ensure continuity of essential work, reinforcing the importance of coordination and planning. Despite these changes, the overall pace of life remained calm and steady. There was no widespread sense of acceleration or urgency. Adjustments unfolded over generations, making them feel natural rather than imposed. Villagers adapted without naming the process, responding to immediate circumstances rather than abstract ideas of progress. The changing perception of time and labor did not signal a clear break from the past. Instead, it reflected an accumulation of small experiences that gradually reshaped understanding. These shifts prepared rural communities, often unknowingly, for later transformations that would require greater flexibility and adaptation. Through this slow reorientation, rural life remained anchored in familiarity. Change did not arrive as disruption, but as a gentle layering of new expectations upon old foundations. The result was a way of life that continued to feel stable, even as it quietly moved toward a different relationship with time, labor, and responsibility. Default text in rural communities, authority was rarely experienced as a distant or abstract force. It was woven into daily life through custom, shared expectation, and long-standing arrangements that had developed gradually over time. Villagers typically understood order through familiarity rather than formal systems. Decisions were shaped by precedent, habit, and the collective memory of how matters had been handled before. This form of governance was not rigid, yet it provided a stable framework within which rural life continued. Local authority often rested with individuals who were recognized for their experience, landholding, or social standing. These figures did not usually govern through overt control, but through guidance and mediation. Their role was to maintain balance, resolve disputes, and ensure that customary practices were respected. Over time, however, the nature of this authority began to shift slightly, reflecting broader changes in rural organization. As land use became more clearly defined and responsibilities more individualized, questions of obligation and accountability grew more specific. Villagers increasingly relied on agreed norms to determine access to resources, participation in communal work, and the resolution of conflicts. These norms were still rooted in tradition, but they were applied with greater attention to consistency. This gradual refinement did not create a new system overnight, but it subtly altered how authority was exercised and perceived. Written records, where they appeared, contributed quietly to this process. Though literacy remained limited, the presence of documents related to land, dues, or agreements introduced a more fixed reference point for decisions. These records did not replace oral tradition, but they supplemented it, offering a sense of permanence that was previously less common. Over time, this influenced how villagers thought about rights and responsibilities, even if such thoughts remained largely implicit. The role of communal assemblies also evolved. Gatherings that had long served as opportunities for shared labor or celebration increasingly became settings for discussion and coordination. Decisions about land use, maintenance of shared resources, or collective obligations were often addressed in these contexts. The process remained slow and deliberate, emphasizing consensus rather than enforcement. External authorities, such as regional lords or administrators, continued to exert influence, but their presence was often intermittent. For many villagers, interaction with these figures was limited to specific obligations or occasions. Still, the gradual integration of rural communities into wider administrative structures introduced new expectations. These expectations were absorbed slowly, filtered through local custom and practice. Despite these influences, village governance retained its familiar character. Authority remained personal and known, grounded in relationships rather than abstraction. Changes were incorporated through adjustment rather than replacement, ensuring continuity even as practices evolved. This quiet evolution of governance did not signal a move toward modern systems in any explicit sense. Instead, it reflected a growing complexity within rural life, as communities balanced tradition with emerging needs. Over generations, these adjustments contributed to a more layered understanding of authority, one that would later support more formal structures without abruptly displacing familiar ways of managing communal life. Knowledge in rural communities was rarely separated from daily activity. Skills were learned through observation, repetition, and gradual participation rather than through instruction alone. Children grew into their roles by watching elders, assisting with small tasks, and slowly taking on greater responsibility. This method of learning emphasized continuity, ensuring that practices remained consistent across generations. As rural life began to experience subtle changes, the transmission of knowledge adapted quietly. New techniques or tools were introduced cautiously, often tested within familiar contexts before being widely adopted. This process ensured that innovation did not disrupt established routines. Instead, it became an extension of existing practice, shaped by experience rather than theory. Craft skills played an important role in this gradual evolution. Spinning, weaving, woodworking, and metalworking were typically carried out alongside agricultural labor. These activities were valued not only for their products, but also for the knowledge they represented. Mastery was recognized through competence rather than formal recognition, reinforcing a culture of practical expertise. Over time, certain skills became more specialized. While most villagers continued to perform a wide range of tasks, some individuals were increasingly known for particular abilities. This specialization did not create sharp divisions, but it introduced a modest differentiation within communities. Villagers sought out those with specific expertise, reinforcing networks of exchange and cooperation. The sharing of knowledge extended beyond the village through markets, seasonal gatherings, and occasional travel. Encounters with other communities introduced variations in practice that could be observed and, if useful, adapted. This exchange was slow and selective, ensuring that new ideas were integrated thoughtfully rather than adopted wholesale. Memory and tradition remained central to this process. Practices were preserved because they were remembered, repeated, and valued. Even as small changes accumulated, the underlying framework of knowledge transmission remained intact. This continuity allowed rural communities to adapt without losing their sense of identity. The gradual evolution of skill and knowledge did not produce immediate transformation. Instead, it created a foundation of adaptability. Villagers became accustomed to learning through experience, adjusting practices as needed while maintaining familiar structures. This capacity for quiet adaptation would later prove significant as rural life encountered more pronounced changes. Throughout this period, knowledge remained embedded in daily life. It was not abstracted or systematized, but lived and practiced. This approach ensured that change unfolded gently, guided by familiarity and trust. As a result, rural communities continued to function with stability, even as they quietly prepared for the broader shifts that would eventually connect them more directly to modern forms of organization and understanding. Rural settlements were shaped over long periods by practical needs, environmental conditions, and inherited patterns of use. Villages often formed where water was available, soil could be worked, and shelter could be constructed with local materials. These locations were rarely chosen through formal planning. Instead, they reflected accumulated decisions made over generations, each adjustment building quietly upon the last. Houses, paths, fields, and shared spaces existed in a balance that felt familiar to those who lived within it. Over time, this balance began to shift in subtle ways. As populations changed and land use became more carefully organized, the arrangement of rural space was adjusted to meet new conditions. These adjustments were not dramatic redesigns, but small changes in emphasis and function. A path might become more clearly defined, a field boundary more firmly marked, or a shared space used with greater regularity. Such changes were often the result of practical necessity rather than intention. The placement of houses within villages also evolved slowly. While early settlements tended to cluster closely for protection and cooperation, later patterns sometimes reflected a desire for clearer separation between household spaces and working land. This did not mean isolation, but it introduced a modest sense of individual household identity within the larger community. Homes remained simple and functional, yet their positioning began to reflect changing relationships between people and land. Shared spaces continued to play an important role in village life. Wells, communal ovens, meeting areas, and paths were used regularly and maintained collectively. As routines evolved, these spaces were sometimes adapted to accommodate new patterns of use. Maintenance became more coordinated, and expectations about responsibility grew more explicit. These developments were absorbed into daily life without creating disruption. Fields surrounding villages also reflected gradual change. Crop rotation, fallow practices, and grazing arrangements were adjusted as experience accumulated. These changes were guided by observation rather than theory, ensuring that they aligned with local conditions. Over long periods, this careful attention reshaped the landscape in ways that supported more consistent production. The boundaries between village and countryside became more clearly understood. While earlier patterns often blurred the distinction, later arrangements emphasized defined zones of activity. This clarity supported coordination and reduced conflict, reinforcing a shared understanding of space. Such developments contributed to a sense of order that felt natural rather than imposed. Despite these adjustments, rural space retained its familiar character. Buildings remained constructed from traditional materials, and the overall appearance of villages changed slowly. The landscape continued to reflect continuity, even as it adapted quietly to new demands. These subtle reorderings of place did not announce themselves as transformation. Instead, they emerged through repeated decisions made in response to everyday needs. Over generations, the cumulative effect of these adjustments reshaped rural space, preparing it to accommodate further change while maintaining the calm stability that defined village life. Family life formed the core of rural society, shaping how work was organized. Knowledge was transmitted, and resources were managed. Households often included multiple generations, with roles defined by age, experience, and capability. These arrangements provided stability, ensuring that labor could be shared and responsibilities balanced over time. Inheritance practices played a significant role in maintaining continuity. Land, tools, and household goods were passed down according to customary arrangements that emphasized preservation rather than division. These practices were designed to sustain the household across generations, reducing fragmentation and uncertainty. Over time, however, subtle adjustments emerged in response to changing conditions. As land became more clearly defined and responsibilities more individualized, inheritance arrangements were sometimes reconsidered. While tradition remained influential, practical concerns encouraged adaptation. Decisions about succession were guided by the need to maintain productive households, even if this required modification of earlier patterns. These adjustments were made carefully, ensuring that continuity remained central. Marriage patterns also reflected gradual change. While unions continued to be shaped by family and community considerations, economic factors gained modest influence. The availability of land, tools, and skills became increasingly relevant, shaping decisions without overriding custom. These influences did not create new institutions, but they added layers of consideration that accumulated quietly. The role of children within households evolves slowly as well. From an early age, children participated in daily work, learning through observation and assistance. As tasks became slightly more differentiated, opportunities for learning expanded. This did not alter the overall structure of family life, but it reinforced the importance of adaptability and skill. Elder family members continued to hold significant influence. Their experience guided decision-making, ensuring that change remained aligned with established values. This intergenerational exchange supported stability, even as practices evolved. Family structures provided a buffer against uncertainty. By distributing labor and sharing resources, households could adapt to fluctuations in harvests, health, and opportunity. This resilience was not the result of planning, but of long-standing arrangements that had proven effective over time. Despite gradual change, the core features of family life remained recognizable. Relationships were shaped by familiarity, obligation, and shared history. Adjustments were absorbed gently, becoming part of the background of daily life. Through this slow evolution, family structures continued to anchor rural communities. They provided continuity amid change, ensuring that transformation unfolded within a framework of stability. This balance allowed rural life to adapt quietly, preserving its essential character while preparing for the more visible shifts that would eventually follow. In rural communities, belief was woven gently into daily life rather than expressed through formal doctrine alone. Understandings of the world were shaped by tradition, observation, and repetition. People interpreted their surroundings through familiar explanations that connected land, weather, health, and fortune to long-established ideas. These beliefs did not exist separately from work or family life, but alongside them, shaping how people made sense of ordinary experiences. Custom played a central role in maintaining stability. Seasonal practices, household routines, and communal observances provided a sense of order that extended beyond practical necessity. These customs were not usually questioned, as they were reinforced through repetition and shared memory. Over time, however, the way these customs were practiced began to shift slightly, reflecting broader changes in rural life. As exchange increased and villages became more connected to wider networks, exposure to different habits and interpretations became more common. Travelers, traders, and neighboring communities introduced variations in practice that were observed quietly. These variations were rarely adopted wholesale. Instead, they were considered cautiously, absorbed only if they aligned with existing beliefs. This process ensured continuity while allowing for gentle adaptation. Rural belief also shaped how uncertainty was managed. Illness, poor harvests, and unexpected loss were understood within familiar frameworks that emphasized endurance and acceptance. These interpretations supported emotional stability, encouraging patience rather than urgency. Even as material conditions shifted slowly, these beliefs helped maintain a calm approach to change. The transmission of belief occurred informally through storytelling, example, and shared experience. Children learned how to interpret the world by watching elders respond to events. Over time, this process reinforced consistency while allowing small adjustments to accumulate. belief remained grounded in lived experience rather than abstract explanation. As rural life gradually changed, belief systems adapted quietly. New experiences were interpreted through familiar concepts, ensuring that change did not feel disorienting. This adaptability helped communities absorb gradual transformation without losing coherence. Despite subtle evolution, belief continued to provide continuity. It offered a framework through which change could be understood as part of a longer pattern rather than a break from the past. In this way, belief supported the slow transition of rural life, anchoring it in familiarity even as conditions evolved. Health in rural communities was understood through everyday experience rather than formal systems. Care was provided within households, guided by observation, tradition, and practical knowledge. Remedies were simple and familiar, relying on available resources and accumulated experience. This approach emphasized continuity, ensuring that care remained accessible and integrated into daily life. Over time, practices related to health began to adapt in small ways. Increased interaction with markets and neighboring communities introduced new ideas about care and prevention. These ideas were considered cautiously, evaluated through experience rather than authority. Useful practices were adopted gradually, becoming part of established routines. The role of certain individuals in providing care became more defined. While most households managed health collectively, some people were recognized for their knowledge and experience. This recognition did not create formal roles, but it reinforced trust and cooperation. Advice was sought through familiarity rather than obligation. Living conditions also influenced health practices. As homes and settlements were adjusted to meet changing needs, attention to cleanliness and maintenance increased subtly. These changes were practical responses rather than deliberate reforms, yet they contributed to improved well-being over time. Diet and food preparation continued to follow traditional patterns, yet small adjustments emerged as exchange expanded. Access to different foods encouraged variation, even if staples remained dominant. These changes were absorbed slowly, aligning with familiar tastes and habits. Health remained closely tied to the rhythms of work and environment. Periods of intense labor were balanced by rest, aligned with natural cycles. This balance supported resilience, even as demands shifted gradually. Care practices remained calm and steady, shaped by patience rather than urgency. Change unfolded through experience, reinforcing continuity while allowing adaptation. In this way, rural well-being evolved quietly, supporting communities as they navigated the slow transition toward new forms of organization and understanding. For much of rural history, movement beyond the immediate village was limited and purposeful. Travel was undertaken when necessary rather than for curiosity, and it followed familiar routes shaped by terrain and tradition. Paths between settlements were known through use rather than design, winding through fields, forests, and open land. These routes connected villages quietly, allowing for exchange without encouraging constant movement. Over time, these patterns of movement expanded gently. As exchange became more regular, villagers traveled slightly farther and more often, though still within modest limits. Journeys to markets, seasonal gatherings, or neighboring communities introduced a wider awareness of place. This awareness did not alter daily routines immediately, but it broadened understanding in subtle ways. Movement of goods accompanied this gradual expansion. Simple items such as grain, cloth, tools, and livestock were carried along established paths. These exchanges were small in scale, yet they contributed to a growing sense of interdependence. Villagers remained rooted in their local environments, but they became more accustomed to interacting with people beyond their immediate surroundings. The experience of travel itself shaped perception. Time spent on the road required planning and patience, reinforcing an understanding of distance that was measured by effort rather than speed. This perspective maintained a calm relationship with movement, preventing urgency from entering daily life. Even as travel became more common, it remained slow and deliberate. Shared routes also facilitated the exchange of ideas and practices. Observations made during travel were brought back to the village and considered quietly. These observations did not compel change, but they provided reference points that influenced decision-making over time. The process was gradual, ensuring that new influences were integrated gently. Movement also reinforced social networks. Family ties, trade relationships, and customary obligations extended across villages, creating a web of connection that remained stable over long periods. These connections supported cooperation and resilience, allowing rural communities to adapt without feeling isolated. Despite this widening sense of connection, rural life remained grounded. Travel supplemented local experience rather than replacing it. Villagers continued to identify primarily with their immediate environment, even as they became more aware of a broader landscape. This gradual expansion of movement and exchange did not disrupt the calm rhythms of rural life. Instead, it layered new experiences onto familiar patterns, preparing communities for future change while preserving stability. Identity in rural communities was shaped by place, family, and shared experience. Belonging was understood through participation in daily life rather than through abstract labels. Villagers knew who they were by what they did, where they lived, and how they contributed to the community. This understanding provided stability, anchoring identity in familiarity. As rural life evolved, this sense of identity began to shift gently. Increased exchange and movement introduced new points of comparison. Villagers became more aware of differences between communities, noticing variations in practice, speech, and custom. These observations did not challenge belonging, but they added nuance to how identity was understood. Participation in broader networks also influenced perception. Engagement with markets, obligations, and shared routes encouraged villagers to see themselves as part of a larger pattern. This awareness did not replace local identity, but it complemented it. Belonging became layered, encompassing both the village and its connections. The language used to describe roles and responsibilities adapted slowly. While traditional terms remained dominant, new expressions emerged through practice rather than decree. These changes reflected evolving relationships between individuals and their work. reinforcing a sense of continuity amid adaptation. Rural identity continued to emphasize cooperation and familiarity. Even as roles became slightly more differentiated, the expectation of mutual support remained strong. This emphasis helped maintain stability, ensuring that change did not undermine social cohesion. Memory played an important role in preserving identity. Stories of past practices, shared experiences, and family histories reinforced a sense of continuity. These memories were not static. They were retold and adjusted to reflect current conditions, ensuring relevance without disruption. As rural communities navigated gradual change, identity remained grounded in lived experience. New influences were interpreted through familiar frameworks, allowing adaptation without dislocation. This process supported a calm transition, preparing villagers to engage with broader forms of organization while remaining rooted in their sense of place. Through these subtle shifts, rural belonging retained its strength. Identity evolved quietly, shaped by experience rather than intention. In this way, rural life continued its slow movement toward modernity, carried forward by continuity as much as by change. In rural communities, tools were not seen as symbols of progress, but as companions to daily work. They were valued for reliability and familiarity rather than novelty. Most tools changed very slowly, shaped by generations of use and careful adjustment. A tool that worked well was kept, repaired, and passed down, while unnecessary change was avoided. This approach supported stability, ensuring that work continued without disruption. Over time, however, small improvements appeared. These improvements were usually modest, refining existing designs rather than introducing entirely new forms. A handle might be shaped differently for comfort, or a blade made slightly more durable through improved techniques. Such changes were often the result of local experience rather than outside instruction. When adopted, they blended easily into established routines. The spread of tools followed social patterns rather than formal systems. Villagers observed one another at work, noticing which tools performed well under familiar conditions. If a tool proved useful, it was copied or shared through local networks. This method of adoption ensured that change remained grounded in trust and practicality. Tools also reflected changing relationships with land and labor. As fields were organized more carefully and work schedules adjusted, tools were adapted to support these arrangements. These adaptations did not increase speed dramatically, but they supported consistency and reliability. The goal remained steady work rather than increased output. Maintenance was as important as use. Tools were repaired repeatedly, often using available materials and techniques. This emphasis on repair reinforced continuity, ensuring that tools remained part of the household economy rather than disposable items. Knowledge of repair was shared widely, supporting resilience and independence. The gradual adoption of improved tools did not create immediate transformation. Instead, it contributed to a slow accumulation of efficiency and confidence. Villagers became accustomed to adapting tools to their needs, developing a quiet openness to change without seeking it actively. Despite these developments, the overall technological landscape remained familiar. Work continued at a measured pace, guided by experience rather than innovation. Tools supported this rhythm, reinforcing calm routines rather than accelerating them. Through this careful approach, rural communities built a foundation of adaptability. They learned to incorporate change gently, ensuring that new tools enhanced rather than disrupted daily life. This capacity would later support more visible transitions, even as rural life remained grounded in continuity. Rural life was deeply shaped by the land. An awareness of environmental conditions developed through sustained observation rather than analysis. Villagers learned to read signs in soil, weather, and vegetation, adjusting their practices accordingly. This knowledge was practical and cumulative, refined through generations of experience. As rural communities adapted gradually, their relationship with the environment also evolved. Changes in land use encouraged closer attention to patterns of growth and depletion. Villagers observed how repeated cultivation affected soil and how grazing influenced vegetation. These observations did not lead to immediate reform, but they informed small adjustments that accumulated over time. Seasonal awareness remained central. Work was timed carefully to align with natural cycles, ensuring that effort was balanced with opportunity. This alignment supported stability, preventing exhaustion and preserving resources. Even as demands shifted slightly, the seasonal framework remained intact. Environmental challenges were managed through cooperation and patience. Periods of scarcity encouraged shared responses, reinforcing community bonds. Over time, these experiences shaped collective strategies for resilience, such as diversification of crops or careful management of shared resources. The landscape itself bore the marks of gradual change. Fields, paths, and settlements reflected accumulated decisions made in response to environmental conditions. These changes were not planned in advance, but they formed a coherent pattern shaped by necessity and familiarity. Respect for the land was not expressed through ideology, but through practice. Careful use, repair, and adaptation reflected an understanding of limits. This approach supported long-term stability, ensuring that rural life remained viable across generations. As communities became more connected and practices evolved, environmental awareness remained a guiding force. New influences were evaluated in light of local conditions, ensuring that change remained grounded. Through this long relationship with the land, rural communities developed a steady resilience. Environmental awareness supported continuity, allowing adaptation without disruption. This balance prepared rural life for future change, rooted in patience and experience. In rural communities, learning rarely occurred in separate or formal spaces. Knowledge was absorbed gradually through daily participation, observation, and repetition. Children learned by watching adults work, listening to conversations, and slowly taking on responsibilities suited to their abilities. This process emphasized continuity, ensuring that learning remained closely connected to lived experience rather than abstract instruction. As rural life evolved, informal learning began to broaden in subtle ways. Increased interaction with markets, travelers, and neighboring communities introduced new forms of awareness. These encounters did not replace traditional learning, but they added layers of information that could be observed and considered. Villagers listened, remembered, and compared, integrating what seemed useful into familiar frameworks. Literacy, where it existed, was limited and unevenly distributed. Reading and writing were not widespread skills, yet their presence influenced rural life quietly. Written notices, records, or markings introduced a sense of permanence that differed from oral transmission. Even for those who could not read, the existence of written material shaped perception, suggesting that knowledge could be fixed and preserved beyond memory alone. Learning remained practical in focus. Skills related to farming, crafting, and household management continued to dominate. However, exposure to new ideas encouraged modest reflection. Villagers became more aware that practices could vary and still function, reinforcing adaptability without undermining tradition. Storytelling played an important role in this process. Accounts of travel, exchange, and experience were shared during gatherings and work. These stories were not treated as instruction, but as context, offering examples rather than directives. Over time, they contributed to a broader understanding of the world beyond the village. The pace of learning remained slow and unhurried. There was no expectation of rapid mastery or formal progression. Knowledge accumulated gradually, shaped by patience and familiarity. This approach supported calm adaptation, ensuring that learning did not introduce urgency into daily life. As awareness broadened, rural communities developed a quiet capacity to interpret change. New information was filtered through experience, accepted cautiously, and adapted gently. This process preserved stability while allowing understanding to expand. Education, in this sense, remained embedded in life itself. It supported continuity even as it allowed subtle growth. Through informal learning, rural communities prepared themselves for future change without abandoning the calm rhythms that defined their existence. Production in rural communities was long guided by immediate necessity. Households produced what they needed to sustain themselves, with surplus treated as a buffer rather than a goal. This orientation shaped decisions about labor, land use, and time, reinforcing a steady rhythm that prioritized reliability over expansion. Over time, this orientation began to shift gently. Opportunities for exchange encouraged households to consider production in slightly broader terms. This did not mean abandoning subsistence, but it introduced the idea that work could serve multiple purposes. A field might be planted with both household needs and potential exchange in mind, balancing tradition with opportunity. This reorientation unfolded slowly. Decisions were guided by experience rather than ambition, ensuring that stability remained central. Households tested possibilities cautiously, adjusting production only when conditions allowed. This approach prevented disruption, allowing change to blend into familiar routines. Coordination between households also evolved. As production became more varied, cooperation took on new forms. Shared efforts were organized with greater attention to timing and contribution, reinforcing mutual reliance. These arrangements remained informal, yet they reflected growing complexity within rural life. The meaning of work adapted alongside these changes. While labor continued to be understood as necessary and communal, it also gained a modest sense of purpose beyond survival. This did not create urgency or competition, but it expanded perspective. Work was still steady and repetitive, yet it carried additional significance. Despite these shifts, the pace of life remained calm. Production continued to follow seasonal rhythms, and rest remained aligned with natural cycles. The reorientation of purpose did not accelerate daily life, but it subtly reshaped understanding. Rural production retained its grounding in familiarity. Change was not imposed from outside, but emerged from within, shaped by practical experience. This ensured continuity even as purpose evolved. To vortex through this gradual reorientation, rural communities moved quietly toward new forms of organization. Production remained steady and measured, supporting a slow transition that preserved calm while allowing adaptation. Rural communities were sustained not only by land and labor, but by enduring social bonds that shaped everyday interaction. Cooperation was not an abstract value, but a practical necessity woven into daily routines. Work in fields, maintenance of buildings, care for animals, and preparation of food often required shared effort. These cooperative practices were learned early and reinforced through repetition, creating a social environment grounded in familiarity and mutual reliance. As rural life evolved gradually, the nature of cooperation adapted quietly. Tasks that had once been shared without distinction began to involve clearer expectations about contribution and timing. These expectations did not weaken social bonds, but they clarified them. Villagers understood who was responsible for particular tasks and when assistance was needed. This clarity supported coordination while preserving a sense of collective responsibility. Social bonds extended beyond work. Gatherings associated with seasonal activities, shared meals, and communal maintenance reinforced connection. Over time, the structure of these gatherings adapted slightly, reflecting changes in work patterns and schedules. Trust remained central to rural cooperation. Agreements were often informal, relying on reputation and memory rather than written record. Even as written references became more common, personal knowledge continued to guide interaction. This emphasis on trust ensured that cooperation remained flexible, allowing adjustment without conflict. Support during times of difficulty reinforced these bonds. Illness, poor harvests, or loss prompted collective response, distributing burden across the community. These responses were shaped by custom rather than policy, ensuring continuity. Over generations, such practices built resilience, enabling communities to absorb change without fragmentation. As roles became slightly more differentiated, cooperation took on additional forms. Individuals with particular skills were relied upon more consistently, while others contributed in complementary ways. This differentiation did not introduce hierarchy, but it added structure. Cooperation became more coordinated, reflecting the growing complexity of rural life. Despite these adaptations, the underlying character of social bonds remained unchanged. Relationships were rooted in shared experience and proximity rather than formal association. Change did not replace cooperation, but refined it. Through this enduring network of social bonds, rural communities maintained stability. Cooperation supported adaptation by distributing effort and knowledge, ensuring that change unfolded within a framework of mutual support. This quiet endurance allowed rural life to remain calm and cohesive, even as it continued its slow movement toward new forms of organization. As rural communities became more connected through exchange and movement, distant influences became increasingly visible. These influences arrived through goods, stories, and occasional encounters rather than direct instruction. Villagers observed differences in tools, practices, and arrangements, noting them without urgency. Such observations expanded awareness while leaving daily routines largely unchanged. Distant influence was filtered through local experience. Practices that seemed unfamiliar were considered cautiously, often discussed within households or among neighbors. Adoption, when it occurred, was gradual and selective. This process ensured that external ideas did not disrupt established rhythms, but instead blended into familiar patterns. Villagers became more aware that their way of life was one among many. This awareness did not diminish attachment to place, but it added perspective. Understanding difference became part of everyday knowledge, absorbed quietly through observation. Authority and obligation were also shaped by distant influence. Expectations associated with broader systems were introduced slowly, often mediated through local figures. These expectations did not replace customary arrangements immediately, but they added layers of responsibility. Villagers adapted by incorporating new requirements into existing frameworks, maintaining continuity. The pace of adaptation remained slow. Distant influence did not compel immediate transformation, as rural communities prioritized stability. Change was evaluated through experience rather than expectation, ensuring that adaptation remained measured. Through this careful engagement with dissident influence, rural life developed a capacity for integration. Communities learned to absorb new elements without losing coherence. This capacity would later support more pronounced transitions, even as daily life continued to feel familiar. Change in rural life rarely announced itself within a single lifetime. Instead, it accumulated gently across generations, becoming visible only when looking back over long periods. For those living within these communities, daily life continued to feel familiar. Tasks were performed much as they always had been, guided by habit and experience. Yet beneath this familiarity, small adjustments were steadily layering upon one another. Each generation inherited not only land and tools, but also slightly altered practices. What had once been an experiment became routine, and what had once been novel became expected. These shifts were subtle enough that they did not disrupt identity or belonging. People adapted without naming the process, responding to immediate needs rather than abstract ideas of progress. Memory played an important role in this accumulation. Elders remembered earlier ways of doing things and compared them quietly with present practice. These comparisons were not framed as loss or gain, but as observation. Through conversation and example, memory guided adjustment, ensuring that change remained grounded in experience. The rhythm of life supported this gradual accumulation. Seasonal repetition created opportunities for reflection and refinement. Each cycle allowed for small corrections, reinforcing practices that worked and discarding those that did not. Over time, this process produced meaningful change without urgency. Households served as vessels for continuity. By maintaining routines while allowing modest adaptation, families ensured stability. Children grew up within familiar patterns that had already absorbed earlier change, making adaptation feel natural. In this way, transformation occurred without rupture. The material environment also reflected accumulated change. Fields, paths, and buildings bore the marks of repeated decisions made over long periods. These marks were not signs of disruption, but of use and care. The landscape itself became a record of gradual adaptation. Social arrangements evolved alongside material conditions. Cooperation, authority, and obligation were refined quietly, shaped by experience rather than design. These refinements supported resilience, allowing communities to manage increased complexity while preserving calm. Through this long accumulation, rural life moved steadily toward new forms of organization. The process was slow enough to preserve familiarity, yet persistent enough to create lasting change. For those within it, life remained steady and recognizable, even as it carried the imprint of generations of quiet adjustment. By the time rural life approached what would later be recognized as modernity, the transition had already been underway for generations. Yet for those living at this threshold, there was no clear sense of arrival. Daily routines continued, shaped by habit and necessity rather than awareness of historical position. Change had become part of the background, woven into the fabric of everyday life. Villagers continued to work the land, maintain households, and cooperate with neighbors much as they always had. Tools were familiar, environments recognizable, and relationships grounded in long-standing practice. At the same time, routines now carried layers of adaptation shaped by earlier adjustments. These layers did not feel new, but they subtly altered how life functioned. The absence of clear markers of transition contributed to continuity. Without dramatic disruption, there was no reason to redefine identity or purpose. Rural life remained calm and measured, even as it operated within slightly altered conditions. Modernity, as later understood, did not arrive as a single event, but as a continuation shaped by accumulation. Awareness of broader change remained limited. News traveled slowly, and abstract concepts held little influence over daily discourse. What mattered was the immediate environment and the stability of the household. This focus preserved calm, preventing urgency from entering daily life. The strength of rural life at this threshold lay in its adaptability. By absorbing change gradually, communities maintained coherence. Practices evolved without abandoning familiarity, ensuring resilience. This balance allowed rural life to transition quietly, retaining its essential character. Standing at this point, rural communities did not see themselves as having left the past behind. Instead, they experienced continuity, guided by routines that had proven reliable. Change was present, but it did not demand attention. In this way, rural life shifted into modernity without noticing the moment of transition. The process was slow, layered, and gentle, shaped by patience rather than intention. Daily life continued calmly, carrying forward the accumulated adaptations of generations, unaware that it had crossed into a new historical condition.